Joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Stephen A. Cook. He is a senior fellow of Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Stephen, we're glad to have you on the program tonight because, of course, with the G20 coming to Toronto in just a few days, we're most interested in shining the light on one country in particular, which is causing a great deal of angst in some parts of the world and a great deal of fascination, to be sure, and that is Turkey. Tell us what you believe Turkey's priorities are as this G20 meeting approaches.
Well, Turkey's priorities are the same that it has been previously, which is to be an acknowledged member of this relatively exclusive club. It's not too long ago that Turkey was the Greece of Europe and the Middle East. In late 2000 and 2001, Turkey went through quite a difficult economic period. But since that time, the Turkish economy has grown consistently and is now the 16th largest economic power in the country, in the world. And it wants to translate this economic weight into political influence. And that's part of Turkey's priority in going to the G20 summit in Toronto and the previous G20 summit. And I learned today that, in fact, the Turks are going to have a bilateral meeting with President Obama, Prime Minister Erdogan and President Obama, which will be another in a string of bilateral meetings between the two leaders. So the G20 is part of a coming out party for a new Turkey, an economically vibrant Turkey, a Turkey that's coming into its own politically and diplomatically.
Well, now that they're having this coming out party, what kind of international responsibilities does Turkey see itself exercising?
Well, that's a great question, Steve. Turkey wants to exercise influence commensurate with what it believes its economic power is and what its future economic growth may be in its immediate neighborhood. That includes Europe, the Balkans, the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and the Middle East in particular. And it's in the Middle East where the Turks have been most active and have been playing a role trying to influence the politics and direction of the Middle East. They have played a role in the Arab-Israeli conflict in mediating between Israelis and Syrians, although that was not a terribly successful effort. They have put themselves out as a bridge between Iran and the West, and they have sought to play constructive roles in Afghanistan and Iraq.
We're trying to figure out, though, this American-Turkish relationship. And actually, just before I ask you the question, do you know whether that meeting is going to take place between Presidents Erdogan and Obama here in Toronto, or will it happen in Washington before the summit?
You know, my understanding is that at the G20 summit, I heard this directly from senior Turkish government officials who are visiting Washington right now, that there is a planned bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Erdogan and President Obama. Now, I haven't heard anything from the White House on this issue. This is just coming from the Turks. That obviously can change between now and the time that the summit begins.
Okay, gotcha. Let me quote you to you, if I can put it that way. This is from your June piece in Foreign Policy magazine. We talk about from friends to frenemies. And here you go. It is hard to admit, you write, but after 6 decades of strategic cooperation, Turkey and the United States are becoming strategic competitors, especially in the Middle East. Among the small group of Turkey watchers inside the Beltway, nostalgia rules the day. U.S. officialdom yearns to return to a brief moment in history when Washington and Ankara's security interests were aligned due to the shared threat posed by the Soviet Union. Returning to the halcyon days of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, however, is increasingly untenable. Why do you think, I think you used the term frenemies later on in the piece, why do you think U.S. and Turkey are turning from friends to frenemies, as it were?
That's really good stuff that you've just read. You
know, saying that because you wrote it?
Of course. If not, I'm not going to flack my own stuff. Who is? All kidding aside, the term frenemy was a half-flip way of getting at the idea that going forward, while American officials have often assumed that the Turks were going to be with the United States no matter what, that, in fact, changes in the international system, changes in Turkey domestically, specifically that Turkey is a more democratic country than it was 10 or 15 years ago, and the changes around Turkey, the economic opportunity that Turkey perceives, will mean that in some instances, the United States and Turkey will cooperate. In some instances, Washington and Ankara are going to have to try to stay out of each other's way. And in some places, Washington and Ankara are going to be at odds with each other. And there are some critical issues in the Middle East in which we already find ourselves at odds with Ankara. One being the Arab-Israeli conflict, in which the Turks have a decidedly different take on the causes, the origins, and ultimately what the solution to the conflict will be. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, on the question of Iran and its drive to develop nuclear technology.
Let me quote somebody who's not nearly as distinguished as you, but this is only the Defense Secretary, Robert Gates. His quote that I want to put to you is, "I personally think that if there's anything to the notion that Turkey is, if you will, moving eastward, it is, in my view, in no small part because it was pushed by some in Europe refusing to give Turkey the kind of organic link to the West that Turkey sought." How much of the estrangement between your country and Turkey right now, Stephen, do you think is because Turkey feels pushed away?
Well, I certainly think that Europe has been duplicitous in dealing with Turkey. Some of that has been intentional, and some of it is Europe's inability to answer a fundamental question, whether it is going to be a geographic entity essentially coterminous with Christian majority countries, or Europe is going to be an idea based on common norms, shared principles, democratic governance. If it's the former, then certainly Turkey is not going to get into the European Union. And it certainly seems that is the direction in which Europeans want to take the European Union. If it's the latter, of which there are many Europeans of goodwill who would like to see it as the latter, certainly Turkey, after time, after further reform, consolidation of democratic institutions and principles, can certainly join the European Union without a problem. I think, though, at the core of it is this question of geography and culture. And when Europeans talk about culture, essentially they're talking about religion. They're talking about the fact that they don't want a country that right now is 74, 75 million people. By the time it would be ready for European Union membership, 80, 81 million people, 99% of whom are Muslims, to enter the European Union. That is a problem. I think it's a contributing factor. The United States has long advocated for Turkey's entry into the European Union, but part of Turkey's present, what they call 360-degree foreign policy, is developing relations with non-traditional allies of Turkey in order to provide Turkey with a set of relationships well beyond that of Europe or the United States. But let me just point out one thing. Certainly, Defense Secretary Gates is quite distinguished and learned about the world. But he said something that I think is not entirely accurate. He said about Turkey moving to the east. In that essay that I did for Foreign Policy magazine, what I said was the easy temptation is to suggest that Turkey is pursuing an Islamist foreign policy and that Turkey is shifting towards the east. I don't believe that's the case. I think that Turkish foreign policy makers have perceived the opportunities for them as a result of this changed world, and that any Turkish government, whether it is a government of Islamist roots, as the Justice and Development Party is, or any of the other parties in Turkey, whether the secularist left or the nationalist right, would be pursuing, with degrees of variation, generally the same kind of foreign policy that the Justice and Development Party is pursuing right now.
Okay, but when Barack Obama became president, you said, here's a possibility. I think you wrote that both Turkish and American officials figured, here's a possibility, here's a moment in history where this thing can kind of get back on the rails, and it hasn't happened. Why do you think it hasn't happened?
Well, because I think the underlying assumption of the strategic relationship, or as President Obama eloquently called it, model partnership, was that Turkey and the United States had common interests and common strategies for achieving those interests. And because over the course of the previous 6 decades, that was in fact the case. Things have changed a bit. It's not something that Turkey watchers and American officialdom have come to easily, but things have changed. Those things, as I pointed out, changes in the international structure, changes in Turkey domestically, the economic opportunities that Turkey perceives in the countries to the south and the east, have shifted Turkey's interests and its strategies about how to go about achieving those interests.
In which case, Stephen, let's focus on one of the things you talked about earlier, which is that there is a divergence of policy right now as it relates to the Middle East, in particular the Israeli-Arab conflict. Do you think the United States should change, modify at all, its relationship with Israel or its position on traditional Middle Eastern issues in order to ameliorate its relationship with Turkey?
This is a very good question, and ever since the flotilla incident on May 31, there has been a strain of the debate, which is about whether Israel is more of a strategic ally to the United States or Turkey is more of a strategic ally of the United States. And I think what the administration is saying is we do not want to be put in a position where we have to choose between these two important countries. Israel is a strategic asset and politically important in the United States in ways that Turkey may not be, and Turkey is strategically important to the United States and politically important in ways that Israel may not be. I think that the Obama administration, since it came into office in January 2009, has sought to alter Washington's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict. From the get-go, the administration identified Israeli settlements as an obstacle to peace. In contrast to its predecessors, it has taken a tough line with the Israelis. But there's only so much room for maneuver for an administration when it comes to Washington's commitment to Israel. That's for political purposes, that's for moral purposes, and that's for strategic purposes. From my own perspective, I think that the administration has approached this issue quite well. There did need to be a change from the Bush administration's policy towards Israel. There is a way of supporting Israel's right to exist and Israel's right to self-defense without enabling some of the worst aspects of Israeli policy, including settlements and other kind of provocative policies.
In which case, Stephen, let's finish on this. For many years, many people in the West have held out great hope that Turkey would be the bridge, if you like, to play that role between the capitalist democratic West and the Muslim East. If the relationship between Turkey and the West is in decline right now, what do you think that says about the possible reconciliation between East and West at this moment in our history?
You know, Steve, there are, over the years, there have been a number of cliches and terms that analysts like myself and others have often used to describe any number of things in international affairs. And one of the big ones when it comes to Turkey is bridge. And Turkey wasn't just important just because of its geography. I tend to think, and this is something even that the Turks bristle at, I tend to think that this idea of a bridge is exaggerated and overblown. The Turks have used this for their own political purposes in their dealings with their European interlocutors and American interlocutors, but there's not as much to this issue as commonly believed. Certainly, the Turks have good relations with countries in the Arab world now in particular. But that does not materially, I think, add to the relationship that the United States has with those countries. For all of the difficulty between Washington and Arab capitals, those Arab capitals continually go to Washington for their diplomatic support, security assistance, and political support.
Understood. Stephen A. Cook, it's good of you to join us from Washington and the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks so much.
Thank you.